Okay, hi everyone. I'm Dorian Traub. I am the co-director of the Center for the Changing Family with Darby Saxby. We are thrilled to have you joining us today for our final roundtable of the year. This is one we're particularly excited about because this is our Center for the Changing Family Student Roundtable, and it is going to feature any of the students at the Center for the Changing Family, or not any, but some of the students at the Center for the Changing Family have funded for their seed research. And that's one of the most exciting things that we get to do at the Center for the Changing Family. Before I dive into that, I want to introduce everybody to Melissa Reyes, who's our wonderful, amazing coordinator for the center, and remind everybody that the center is really a place to bring together folks across the university campus who have interest in research related to family caregiving, and that really is across the lifespan. So we currently have affiliates at both the doctoral student level, postdoc, and faculty level, and folks spanning everything from Children's Hospital to our Division of Gerontology. I think almost every academic unit at the university is represented. So if you are interested in joining us at any time, please feel free to shoot us an email and we would be happy to have you added to our listserv. Right now, I am very excited to introduce Bridget Cotter, who has been stepping in to coordinate some activities around our PhD students in the center, and we're so grateful to her for doing that. And Bridget is going to introduce our speakers for the day. Go ahead and take it away, Bridget.
Hi, Dorn. Thanks. Hi, everyone. So we are so excited to have these two students who I have personal relationships with and have, been in class with, and who are really great scholars presenting today. So first we will have Yingyi Lin. She is a PhD in population health and place, and she's going to be presenting her working paper. And then after we'll have Elisa Shimada. She's working on her dissertation. She's going to be presenting her third paper, piece of her third paper that she's working on right now. And she's also in the Department of Sociology. So Yingyi, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bridget. It's so nice to see you again here. So I'm gonna share my screens, right? Like my slides. I don't know. Oh, yes, I can do that. I have a very short presentation, and as Bridget's introduction is a working paper of mine. So yeah, it's gonna be a short talk, and it's actually a project also funded by CCF 2 years ago to aid in to help me getting some restriction data of this paper. Okay, so my project is really looking at the community level salience of China's one-child policy on patterning child health. For those of you, I don't know how to not quite sure why. Okay, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the policy, so it was a policy introduced in 1979 and was lifted in 2015. So it was a policy that has been implemented for over 3 decades, mainly to pose a birth control quota on couples to just have one child across many populations in China, although there are some there were some policy variation. So these very unique population control policy has generated motivated numerous research, and this research mainly looking at the policy implications for children's health. And most of these research has a very uniform focus on the family level change that brought about by the policy on patterning children's health outcomes. So a very common research question of this type of research is asking, what is the impact of being the only child in your family? as compared to your peers who are not the only child of the family who has siblings. So that's a very, very common, and it's a widely studied research topic. So basically what is widely known is that being a singleton often means that you have more family level resources that's funneled to you, which makes sense. It's a very well-established association, even like among research conducted by a lot of economists, like the so-called quantity-quality trade-off. If you have a smaller family size, then kids in the family more likely to have more resources. So my paper is really building upon these strand of widely studied research on a family level implication of the policy to look beyond the family influence to ask the question, so we know that the impact of being a singleton matter. And then what I ask here is that does the prevalence of singletons who is living around you matter for parenting children's health experiences? So basically it's a question asking if there is any salience of community context brought about by differential policy uptake across local communities in China. So this question, asking the contextual salience of the policy is actually very relevant. So here in this figure, I just want to give you a brief sense of how different people are experiencing China's one-child policy in different places. So what you see here is a very simple graph that I graph out the community prevalence of singletons by the 12 provinces included in this data set I use. And each dot here, what you're seeing is each local community within each capital city or each provinces. So there are a total of like almost like 2,000 local communities here. And we can clearly see that the percentage of only children in each community like really vary like substantially from 0% to almost 100%. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the policy, although the policy was known as this one-child policy occurring as this shock to China, but actually the policy have a lot of variation. For instance, in rural areas, the policy was not that successfully implemented because rural couples tend to, they really want a son, like the prevalence of sons. So in some places, the policy actually allow couples to have a second child if the first child is a girl. So due to many, many reasons, like also in different provinces, the government restriction is also at different level. So due to these like many reasons, some I mentioned, some I haven't mentioned. So the reality is that across these local places, immediate surrounding of children's everyday living, the experiences of like who is living around you is really, really different. So my paper really leveraged this variation to see if the policy also have contextual level influence on parenting child health, in addition to the widely known knowledge that the policy has changed families themselves. So basically in this paper, I just asked like two questions. First is whether these very contexts I just show you across different communities spill over to pattern the health status of all children, in addition to and beyond the family level differences of the children themselves, like on whether they are a singleton or not. And especially this paper of mine takes a gender lens to differentiate the gender climate associated with this community level spatial variation of the differential policy uptake. So basically, I also look at percentage of singleton boys in a community versus percentage of singleton girls in a community, whether they have equally similar salience in patterning child health. And second, I also asked the question of does this varied one-child family context also moderate the child health disparities we know? As I was saying in my first slide, the one-child policy is widely studied as a family level change, and people know that being a singleton oftentimes means that you receive more resources. So we do have these child health disparities in China, that singleton children like receive more health resources as compared to non-singletons. So building on that, I also want to understand, thus living in different communities also means that we see different types of child health disparities. How big is that health gap in different levels of communities with different levels of policy uptake? So I just have 2 slides here explaining some of the theoretical framework of why I think community, different levels of singleton boys versus singleton girls would have differential salience in patterning child health. So to start with, let's look at communities with a very high prevalence of singleton boys. First of all, these kind of communities are actually very common. So that means among all singletons, majority of these singletons are boys. This is a very unique unintended consequence of China's one-child policy, because overall Chinese society is one that with a very strong boy preference. And during the time when the policy was implemented, it was also a time that medical technologies were availing to help couples to achieve their fertility intentions. So what I meant there is sex selection. So some couples do have the ability to choose what they want. If under the policy, that means they can only have one child. So they can do prenatal sex selection to ensure that their only child is a boy. So actually, demographically in China, percentage of singleton boys are higher than that of percentage of singleton girls. So in this context, I suspect that not all children are favored. Clearly, we know that boys are more favored, and this kind of preference, of course, will spill over to even families have more than one child. That just means that girls are less prevalent, less preferred. And I also want to know that these types of entrenched some prevalence is not unique in China. Even in context without such very strict population control policies, we see the same thing. Globally, we see fertility decline, and in context with traditional patriarchal value, places like North Africa, Middle East, South Asia, we see the same thing. Even without any one-child policy, we still see that there is this selection to have only one boy, or even if they have 2 children, they still want a boy. So I present my first hypothesis is that in a community with a higher percentage of singleton boys, I think this context does not correspond with equal investment in all children. Instead, that kind of context corresponds with more investment in boys and less investment in girls. So in regression models, I would expect an interaction term. And turning to communities with a very high prevalence of singleton girls, I think, first of all, these kind of contexts means that couples are willing to stop childbearing, even though they were allowed to only have one child, even though that only child is a girl, whose gender is not often preferred in a Chinese society. So in that case, I suspect that all children are favored, including girls. And moreover, there is actually this emerging body of research also look at in these type of contexts, women are not only benefit in terms of more health investment, they also likely benefit in many other ways that I postulate to shift the broader societal context to funnel more societal resources to children. What I meant is that in this kind of context, if women are more supported to get education, employment, and probably eventually participate in policy making, research has shown that if women are politicians, they're more likely to build bathrooms, clinics, child health clinics, these kind of broader societal resources to benefit children versus for instance, men who are in the power of policy making. So here I present my second hypothesis is that communities with a higher level of singleton girls correspond with more investment in all children, and regardless of the gender or the regardless of the family structure of children themselves. So to answer my research question and to explore the 2 hypotheses that I presented, I used these public use data, China Health and Nutrition Surveys. I use like a total of 9 worth of surveys, which has survey more than 300 local communities. These 300 local communities, as I was presenting in my first figure, they have a very, very wide spatial variation in terms of the key exposure variable I'm interested here. Community prevalence of singleton boys versus girls. And for the outcome, I use a very direct indicator of investment, health investment, but then I do look at the case of overinvestment, like whether children's weight increase to a threshold that actually indicates a health disadvantage. Regarding my analytical approach, I mainly do a logistic regression model to see whether the community level of singletons predicts children's own risk of overweight. And first of all, I look into whether there's this like overall spillover. And second, I look further whether this like spillover is actually not universal. Like for instance, do we see a different association between boys versus girls? Of course, in these analytical models, I control a lot of things. Like I'm happy to discuss later on if you're interested, but I want to highlight that the most important covariates I control for is the community level socioeconomic status, which is known to confound the relationship I'm interested here. And I also want to highlight that restricted community level data is actually the data that CCF has funded me to get that data, which become this main contribution of the paper. So I'm really thankful for that. So to present my results, I will first introduce you a very descriptive finding. So I did confirm with the brief demographic profiles in terms of communities children are exposed to. So on the left panel here is the percentage of singleton boys across local communities versus the right panel percentage of singleton girls. And we do see that the percentage of singleton boys is higher than that of the percentage of singleton girls, signaling some preferences that a high proportion of families selecting to have one boy. And then regarding the analytical results, I'm showing you the model results in one figure. So basically, I find like totally opposite findings regarding the salience of community level of singleton boys versus girls in patterning children's risk of overweight. So looking at the left panel here, as community prevalence of singleton boys increases, the x-axis here, children's risk of probability of overweight decreases for all children, regardless of their gender, which is like demonstrating in this like lower level of investment. However, conversely, in the right panel here, we can see that as the community prevalence of singleton girls increases, children's probability of being overweight actually increases for all children. And both of these, like, although it's like totally opposite finding, but none of them has this like significant interaction effect. That means these are like universal spillover. So a summary of my results, starting with the salience of community level of singleton boys, I found that it actually does not correspond with any health disadvantage for any children, but rather this is similarly health advantage, corresponding with a lower risk of overweight for all children. If you can recall my hypothesis one, this finding partially supporting my hypothesis one, because in hypothesis one, I hypothesized that such contests correspond with lower investment in all girls, right? But then here, I also found the same thing for all boys. This is actually the biggest puzzle of this paper that I'm not quite sure why. The only possible explanation I can come up with is this how parents' investment behavior might also adapt to societal changes brought about by a large number of families selecting to have boys. So there is this like demographic phenomenon in China right now called marriage squeeze, because we have more boys than girls. So when these boys grow up, it's very hard for them to find a partner. So I wonder if the outcome I'm looking at here is also actually a form of less like attractiveness, like being overweight is less attractiveness. So that means like in places with a lot of boys, a lot of singleton boys, probably parents just invest less strategically to increase the attractiveness of their sons as well. And turning to my second aspect of the community, a higher level of singleton girls, I found my findings fully corroborating with my hypothesis that is such a context with it corresponds with higher investment in our children, but then it crosses over to turning to these higher risk of overweight among all children, which signals actually a health disadvantage. I have one last slide here. The key takeaway that I'm hoping my paper can has is really to remind researchers and the wider policy-making community is that this policy has not only changed family themselves, like it's not only whether the kids are the only child, him or herself or not, but also the policy has changed the landscape of families in local communities in ways that are salient for parenting, child health, and even more broadly, population health. And that's the end of my presentation. Again, I'm really grateful for the grant provided by CCF to get the data for me to complete this project. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. That was really awesome. I do have, I don't know if anyone else has any questions. I can let anyone else go first if they'd like, or comments.
Hi, Yingyi. I love your project. I thought it was so interesting. I was really interested in your thoughts on the results, especially like your interpretation. I thought that was super interesting and cool, like how these different societal norms around attractiveness and partner selection and all those things could impact also the like you said, the strategic investment in for the parents. So I was wondering if because obviously, like, I'm going to like be very honest about my ignorance about Chinese beauty standards and things like that. Do you think so that's why I'm asking this question, do you think that this I guess words are hard. Do you think that this idea of thinness and attractiveness, do you think that would also spill over to women as well, or does it maybe work differently in that case? Like, I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I loved your project. This is the question was a thinly veiled way to say, like, I love your project. Your project is awesome.
Yeah, I thought about that. Actually, I felt like that thought of you strongly support the explanation I put out in the last slide, because I think in East Asian societies, like societal norms or restrictions on women's weight and fitness is more strict, right? It's harsher. So if parents of boys are thinking about to increase the attractiveness of their sons, that I just think that just means that the norms on women's weight would be even harsher. So I do think that those norms of those boys' parents would shift to like girls living around. So, but again, in my hypothesis one, I already think that it's just very theoretical strong to assume that girls in those environments with a lot of singleton boys who prefer boys, they already receive less investment. So, but then I think your thought like better support that hypothesis that for sure girls in those contexts with a strong preference of boys, their risk of overweight is the lowest. If that answers your question. And for the weight norm things, I did a lot of things in my models to really make sure that my results are not confounding by those like norms of weight. For instance, I control a lot of fixed effects of province, like across a different region, those like unobserved and like very hard to measure things. So yeah, but I really like your thought, which I have thought about it as well. I think if anything, it better supports the possible explanation of why I'm seeing those results. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I loved your project again. Awesome job.
Just very quickly, one question for you, Yingyi. So you mentioned earlier in the presentation, this, you know, dispersion of individuals based on rural versus urban areas. So I was wondering if you are continually taking that into consideration in your results when you think about clusters of individuals who are overweight in rural areas versus urban areas, and what that looks like, if there's a a continuation of that. Do you want to speak to that a little bit, if that's not something that you looked at?
Yeah. First of all, rural urban differentials was not the focus of my research. So it ended up, these like variable ended up a covariate in my model. But it has been the research focus when people study, like especially the social consequences of China's one-child policy. And one interesting thing I found in my finding is that when people often think about rural couples are the ones that have really strong son preferences, actually in my paper or in like recent papers, people found that actually urban couples are not that different. Because in my introduction, I talk about during the 30 years when the policy was implemented, the past 3 decades, it was also the time that medical technologies were emerging, like things like ultrasound technology that enable the detection of the fetus gender, right? So actually, it was only people with more money were able to afford that. So in some places, we even see in places like Beijing, Shanghai, those very developed areas, they also have a very skewed sex ratio. It's not really about urban rural differentials. I think in the context of China, it's also this advantage of whether you have the ability, you have the money, you have the resources to achieve your fertility intentions. So even in China, some people can migrate to places like Hong Kong or even America. Like those places are legal for fetus gender detection. So actually, to some extent, those very rich urban couples are the one that contributing to this like skewed sex ratio. And that also means that they have a very, very strong son preferences. But yeah, like the rural urban differentials ended up a covariate in my model, not only because it was not the focus of the paper, and also because I think it's more than that. Like even urban couples, they have the ability as well as the preference. Yeah. But I really appreciate that insight. I consider that. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Thank you so much. So we'll move on just for the sake of time, if that's okay. Thank you so much. That was a really great presentation. So Elisa, would you like to take it away with your paper?
Yes, so like Bridget mentioned, this project was funded by CCF, and I'm just going to present one paper out of the 3 articles in this dissertation. Again, like Yingyi said, I'm super grateful to CCF for the funding. Really, that's like CCF's funding is what made this all happen. So super grateful. I'll say it again at the end, but thank you, CCF. So I want to focus today on the 3rd paper of this dissertation, which focuses on the young adult subsample in my study. So I'll just jump right in without any further ado. When I asked Murphy, a 21-year-old theater student, about his experience at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, this is what he had to say. I was just really excited to get out of my family's house. Finally, I was learning and in college, and then 7 weeks in, I'm sent right back. Every time I heard the lockdown was extended, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm in high school again. I couldn't really have the college experience, which is something that I'm still processing right now. So yeah, it was pretty rough. You're back home like, well, it's back here again. getting used to that and learning, online learning and balancing work and also my relationship, all from my childhood bedroom. It really was like a fight for your autonomy. As I was conducting interviews for my dissertation, which overall it was just about relationships during the pandemic and how those were affected by the pandemic's fallout, responses like Murphy's became all too common. Young adults feeling stagnated or isolated or a sense of lost independence. And their responses to the pandemic's fallout made perfect sense to me because much of the family social literature talks about these sort of cultural ideals of young adults setting out on their own, away from their families, and then getting an education and then a job, and then starting their independent life with a possibility in the future of getting married and having children. So using the life course perspective, family sociologists have argued that traditional markers of adulthood like marriage and childbearing are being replaced by economic milestones like financial self-sufficiency, like home ownership or long-term career stability. But these milestones, as somebody who's 25 years old, I know these milestones are taking longer and longer to achieve. So that's created a new life stage in adulthood between adolescence and full-grown adulthood, which family social people call emerging adulthood. So emerging adulthood is often associated with periods of exploration, identity formation, and instability, a lot of time precarity. It's a period of many transitions. So moving away from your family's household, finishing school, and starting a career. So a subsection of the emerging adulthood literature highlights the changing relationship that parents have with their young adult children. So many young adults feel like they have to struggle to renegotiate that relationship as they're still trying to figure out who they are as adults, while their parents still see them as their kids, as children, essentially. And though it can be difficult, the renegotiation of this process helps young adults re-solidify their attachments and their bond with their parents, and also helps them shape their own independent identity. So separate from that, another stream of research shows that romantic intimacy becomes increasingly important during this period of life. So developmental theories in this literature argue that young adults navigate all of the decisions that I talked about before, all of those transitions, while reconciling their own goals and desires with the goals and desires and expectations of their partner. So this shows how young adults navigate their independent life while simultaneously honoring their romantic commitment. So in all, if you look at the literature separately, there we go, they're all together now. When you look at these two streams of literature separately, it shows the kind of deep embeddedness and the balance that young adults try to strike between their independent identity and the relationship with their parents, and their independent identity with their relationship with their partner. The literature that brings the family, partner, and independent identity together, though, paints a slightly different picture. It paints a picture of young adults asserting their independence by distancing themselves from at least one of these relationships. So, for example, in cases where parents prohibit their child from having a romantic relationship, hookup culture can provide a compromise between experiencing intimacy and respecting their parents' wishes, while at the same time avoiding romantic attachment at all. On the flip side of the coin, Rosenfeld and Kim talk about the rise of interracial and same-sex unions to data that young adults have geographically and ideationally moved away from the influence of their parents. So all of these different streams of literature highlight different images of young adulthood. One image is that of separation and moving away from parents or partners, while the other literature that I talked about highlight the deep embeddedness and connection that young adults have with these relationships. So this made me wonder, how do the roles of independent young adults, committed romantic partner, and responsible family member all interact with each other at the same time? And does independence have to equal distance for one or both of these relationships when you take all of this balance together simultaneously? So the COVID-19 pandemic, I found, could be a useful case study to analyze how all of these roles interact, because it made young adults' management of all these roles kind of in their face. It made it much more acute and visible. Because of the rapid changes in living arrangements, a lot of them had to transition to remote work or to remote school. the social isolation of quarantine, all of these things place young adults in this new position of instability, of anxiety, of stress, as well as like new responsibilities that they have to navigate. So this unprecedented historical moment presents many new challenges and crossroads for young adults to face for themselves in their relationship and in their romantic relationship and in the relationship with their families. So like I said, this paper is part of a larger dissertation, larger project, which talks about just how the pandemic affects couples. That was kind of the main impetus for this study. And for the entire project, including the data I'll present here, participants were recruited through social media sites like Instagram and Reddit, just to keep all of the recruitment process safe for myself and for the participants too. And in order for the data to be used in this paper, interviewees had to be with their partner for at least 6 months at the time of interview and display at least one of the markers in emerging adulthood that the literature talks about. So transitioning between education and beginning their career path, beginning to build independent financial stability, or moving out of their parental home, their family home. So with those kind of filters in place, in the end, this paper uses in-depth interviews, which were conducted on Zoom, again, for safety reasons, with 30 romantic partners. So 15 couples, essentially, from ages 18 to 30 years old. So using participants' experiences during the pandemic as a case study, I challenged the idea that young adults have to leave familial responsibility or romantic commitment behind in the process of forming their independent selves. Instead, I argue that young adults bridge these familial and romantic relationships together through negotiation, arguments, and boundary setting. And it's through these relational processes that they assert their independent identities and create those identities for themselves too. I want to tell you a story now about Ron. So Ron is a 20-year-old photographer, and he remembers how challenging it was to transition from living on his college campus back to living with his parents again, and bringing his new partner, Kim, into this tense dynamic. So he says, the move back home was a very jarring experience. I just ended up arguing with my parents a lot. Then I had to merge the Kim part of my life with the family part of my life. Since I was living at home and she was coming up here to visit his family, that was something I was going to have to cross over for that to work. So echoing those pre-pandemic studies of young adults who move back in with their parents, that renegotiation process I was mentioning, the young adults in this study initially felt a sense of stagnation and a lack of autonomy. And some took it a step further from stagnation. It's not just we're standing still, we're actually going backwards, like what Murphy said in the beginning about feeling like he was in high school again. So the pandemic's disruptions to interviewees' experiences like Ron's or like Murphy's made visible the tension between their multiple roles as an independent adult, as a family member, and as a romantic partner. But finding this balance was crucial for them, like Ron says here. It was a very challenging process, though. So I want to talk about I'll talk about negotiation and boundary setting just for the sake of time. We'll talk about negotiation first. So that was one strategy that young adults used to build and balance and bridge their multiple roles. So for example, Daisy, a 22-year-old college student, recounts how she negotiated with her partner, Joshua, during lockdown, after the lockdown officially ended, and he wanted to spend time with her in person, but also hang out with his friends. So this is what she says. I just told him, stay strong. You should be doing this for your own good and for your family, regardless of what everybody else is doing. If you want to see me, then you really can't go out and stuff, because that puts me at risk and my family at risk. So basically I'm saying, don't go out. If you want to see me, if you go out, you won't see me for a longer period of time. So Daisy made it clear when she was talking to me throughout her interview how important it was that she maintained a strong bond with Joshua while not getting her family sick with COVID. So in this ultimatum, she called on Joshua's responsibility to himself and his family, as well as his responsibility to her and her family because he's her partner. So Daisy advocated for her and her family's needs while keeping up her romantic commitment to Joshua by still agreeing to spend time with him in person, as long as he didn't spend time with his friends. Oh, sorry, I'm doing arguments and negotiations. So sometimes the tension grew so great that it actually led to pretty tense arguments between partners and parents. So Jackson, who's a 20-year-old student, and his partner, Kate, both talk about this difficult time that they had in their relationship when Kate's parents didn't let them see each other, while Jackson's parents were a lot more lax about them meeting in person. And so Jackson remembers how this caused tension for them. I think looking back, I wanted to see her more often and call less. And I would say, can you please ask your parents? And she'd say, no, I don't want to. And Jackson says for himself, I was being selfish for sure, but I just didn't understand why her parents would even get angry at her for asking. I was upset that I couldn't see her more. So in the midst of these competing expectations from her partner and from her parents, at first, Kate felt it was easier to argue with Jackson rather than argue with her parents. So she said to me in the interview, I'm really bad at taking initiative against my parents culturally. I don't want to be disrespectful or anything like that. Eventually, though, after going through this tension with Jackson for a while, she argued with her parents in order to find a compromise where she could see Jackson while respecting their wishes. So she says, that's where I argued. I started being like, okay, if you guys can go out and go shopping and do whatever, why can't I also go out and see him a little bit more, like once a week? And so I argued my point, then it got through to my parents. So Kate advocated for herself to fulfill these personal and romantic needs while honoring her parents' wishes at the same time and their concerns. And her experience is one example of how bridging these competing roles is a way to assert her autonomy and independence. So like I said before, through bridging romantic, familial, and individual responsibilities, though it can lead to tension and sometimes arguments with loved ones, it paints a very different picture of young adult independence. Through these kind of difficult relational processes, young adults are asserting independence by advocating for themselves and their needs through, like I said, through arguments, through negotiation, and through boundary setting, while not completely separating themselves from their families or their partners. So they're honoring all of those commitments while asserting their own independent identity. So findings from this paper suggest that young adults' multiple roles as a partner, as a family member, and as a young adult should be seen as interactions with each other and happening all together simultaneously. So I think one of the implications of this could be useful in multiple streams of research on young adults, particularly, I won't go into this too much, but basically talking about cumulative disadvantage. So for example, if a couple has one partner whose family requires a lot more financial investment on the part of the couple, or maybe time investment in taking care of them because they're sick, that they're going to have a very different outcome than a couple whose families don't necessarily require those levels of support. I have some quotes and stuff to share with you. If you're interested, I can do that in the Q&A, but just for the sake of time, those are my key ideas. I want to say once again, thank you to CCF, because y'all really made this research possible. And I also want to thank Maggie and Katie, my two amazing RAs that are also instrumental in making this happen. So thank you.
All right, well, that was great. Thank you so much, Elisa. Yeah, so let's open the floor for questions. I definitely have at least one. This is great. Yeah, Yingyi, you want to?
Yeah, I can start. I have one comment and one question. So the comment is that actually like the last paper of mine is also looking at these like emerging adulthood, that being an adult means a lot of things, a lot of transitioning stages and different responsibility and roles, interaction with other people, right? And I just want to make a comment that I like the quantitative data I have does not have these level of details. So I could not wrap my head around how to do that, because I'm looking at like adults moving away from households, like when they get married and when they get kids, it's like too many like intertwined social relationships. So I'm so happy that I got to listen to this little talk of yours to really disentangle the complexity of all these relationships, like especially under a very stressful time, like the pandemic. And so that's the overall comment. I really like these pieces of like quantitative work. Yeah. And a question of mine is that I saw that your couple sample ages from 18 to 30, right? So in this project of yours, do you also look into whether these couples have kids or they're not yet in the stage of childbearing?
So that was actually something that I wanted to look at because just because I was thinking the same thing, like that's another role that they had to, by the way, thank you. That was so sweet. All of your feedback. And thank you for that question, because that is something I got really excited about as we were collecting that data, because I was like, okay, like what about as we were starting to recruit older emerging adults, like in their mid to late 20s, I was like, okay, well, how are they going to add this new role of parent to this situation? And it just happened to be that we didn't end up recruiting any adults that were that were parents, at least in this, that fit the criteria, that fit the filtering criteria. A lot of the parents had already been, that were in this study, were well established in their careers. They had financial stability, they had homes. And that could also be due to, you know, the changing cultural and demographic patterns that we see, right? That often people want to have that kind of financial stability before marrying and having children and whatnot. So I would assume that, especially for mothers, because I'm thinking about work by Sharon Hayes and scholars like her about this idea of intensive mothering, right? Where like all of your priority goes to your children. So it kind of makes it, that role becomes the most salient if you become a parent. But that's just my like thought about it, just thinking about the other literature I know. I really wish that we had found that we were able to recruit parents in the sample. But yeah, that was something I was thinking about for sure.
Yeah, I think your suspicion is that what I observed, like my real world observation, is that if they have a kid, especially under 5-year-old kid under in pandemic in their household, I feel like all those parents I know personally, they most worry about the kids themselves. I feel like that's like a priority. Like they sacrifice like friends gathering, etc. because of the kids. Like, yeah. But thank you for that.
Exactly. No, yeah, I was thinking the same, just based on like literature that I know. It's like that once you become a parent, like that cultural ideal of like intensive parenting, like we become like your kid is your everything. So I'm wondering, it would have been cool to see that, to see if that effect had happened. But yeah, definitely. I've been thinking about it. I love that. Thank you.
Mei, you're muted. Yeah.
Hi guys, it's really great to come here and listen to both of your talks. I'm so excited to see how the projects have evolved. And I have comments and questions for both of you, if you guys don't mind. For Elisa, it's really great to really finally see the project is coming together, and I'm very, very excited to see how you add to the literature by bringing this piece of you see more of like the young adults, they not just have tensions when they try to build their own identity, but they try to bridge their different relationships. And my question for you is, I'm wondering if you see your findings as very specific to the COVID period, because the young adults, they have to move back to their families. So that's why they don't have the space for themselves or for their romantic partners as they would have in like non-COVID times. How do you think it will affect, like, whether the patterns you found will continue or discontinue in the on-COVID time or so-called normal times? And also, I really loved Yingyi's talk as well. And I think I echoing what Elisa and Bridget's question. I think my question is that I'm just having a little bit of doubts about your measure of using the risk or the probability of getting overweight as a measure of family spending sources on their children, because I think your hypothesis is well laid out, and I think your hypothesis really makes sense. And I am also a little bit surprised to see the no results. So I was thinking, like what Elisa was trying to say, that whether being overweight is really an indicator of parents spending enough resources on their children. Because thinking about my own experience, my family always want to feed me more than what I eat, and I think I almost got overweight when I was in high school. But there are other things that are like we're very sure that is an indicator of family spending resources on their children, such as getting education. And maybe, but I totally understand that of course, you want to study the health related outcomes. So I was thinking maybe you could kind of just like run a simple test and see if being able to get into higher education and the risk of overweight is really correlated, and whether this correlation is kind of on a similar, whether you have similar level of correlation across the times, because as we know, as China getting more and more economically developed, maybe people are paying more attention to being overweight or not. Because in the past, the food security was still a problem, so people just eat as they can. So these are my comments and questions. Thank you, but great project. Really great seeing you, and great to see you, Bridget, too.
Thanks, Mei Yang. Oh, Yingyi, I'm fine with going before or after you. Okay. So yeah, thank you, Mei Yang. And actually, Mei Yang and other colleagues of mine have been really helpful in giving me feedback and helping me with this project, this paper in particular, because I took a dissertation finishing class with Dr. Corey Nelson, who's awesome. And so in that class, Mei Yang actually helped me with this paper, which is, I'm so grateful. So the question about historical specificity is something I've been thinking about for all the papers in this project. I think for this pattern in particular, I'm pretty confident that it may, as now, especially like as the lockdown is has become more lax, as all of these COVID restrictions are lifted, maybe the effects aren't as visible or like in your face. But I think that this idea of having to negotiate set boundaries or argue to bridge these relationships are something that young adults still do, even not in the pandemic. So I'm thinking about like if a couple wants to, if my partner gets a job in Boston, and are we going to move to Boston, or are we going to stay here in LA because both of our families are in LA? That's just a personal example, but I just think about like choice of college or where to live or when to have kids. Like all of these different considerations take into account our own, where we think we're at and in ourselves and our life stage, where our partner is at in their life stage, what they're thinking about and what we think that they're thinking about, right? And then our families as well, and what we think about their expectations. So for this paper in particular, I'm still trying to work out the kinks for the other two papers, but I think that this one, I have confidence that it's not COVID specific, but it works in a slightly different way. Like you're saying, COVID caused such sudden disruption and so many disruptions that it was so obvious, but it happens to adults all the time, like young adults all the time, all these different processes, I think. Thank you, Megan.
Great, thanks. Yeah, just we have just a few more minutes left, so I'm sorry to rush you.
No problem. I'm really thankful for your comments. We can talk later in private, but the main reason I think education is the perfect outcome for a parent resource to really delineate whether boys are more preferred than girls, because education is this like super fundamental human capital that we all care about nowadays, right? The reason why I did not pick education just because my sample is children, so they haven't reached college education. So basically I'm looking at sensor data. So I just don't know yeah, like how to do that. But if we are talking about like a group of like 30-year-old women and men, then yes, I can look at their college attainment, college graduation rate, etc. Yeah, but allocation, it's a perfect outcome. I wanted to do that, but my mentor was like, I couldn't do it. Like I try to differentiate public versus private school, because that's also a clear indicator in especially China context, whether you are receiving good or like a general education, right? But my data doesn't have that. So I really appreciate that comment. I did integrate a lot of educational literature to really support the argument of investment and what is the direction, whether it would be gender specific, etc. But yeah, we can talk more like later. I don't want to like spend all the time like here. But thank you so much, Bridget.
Yeah, thank you to both speakers. This was really awesome. Thanks for everyone who popped in and asked questions. This is really awesome. And thank you to the USC Center for the Changing Family for connecting us in a multidisciplinary setting. This is really awesome. And I look forward to hearing about how these projects come to life further. And yeah, we will see you all soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you.
Yes. And
Thank you. Bye.
thanks, everyone.